Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. Terrorism has time and again raised its ugly head. It is a global menace that several countries are trying to deal with on a war footing. From the Americas to Asia, no continent is free from the problems of terror. New Delhi has been raising the issue with other countries bilaterally and at international forums to try and tackle the problem. Over the years, India has had to deal with both foreign terrorists and local elements from time to time. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has taken up the issue with several of his counterparts, and if there is one common agenda as far as world leaders are concerned, it is to fight terror. Thousands of lives have been lost due to terror-related activities, yet there are some nations that use it as a tool of state policy and try to further their goals. On Anti-Terror Day today, we will analyze how to combat the global problem. Joining me on the program today are Prabhu Dayal, former diplomat, Swaran Singh, Professor Diplomacy and Disarmament, JNU, Jaidev Ranade, former Additional Secretary, Research and Analysis Wing, and Lieutenant General retired Vinod Bhatia, former Director General of Military Operations. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. General, I'd like to begin with you. First and foremost, let's try and put into perspective how big a problem terrorism really is globally.
Well, globally, I think the security challenge is terrorism world over. It is not confined to a single country. It's a global issue, a global problem. And you find that, a lot of resources in terms of time and money is being spent on anti-terror operations, how to combat terrorism, how to control terrorism, to get the, what we call the homeland security right. So this is a global problem and it will continue to be a global problem. I don't see the end of terrorism coming so soon, in spite of a global war on terrorism that is not coordinated. Unfortunately, we as nations, responsible nation states, do not even agree to a common definition of terrorism. So I don't, we talk of terrorism a lot, but when it comes to actually acting against terrorism, I have my national interests first, and I have my, let's say in the case of India, we know that the terrorism, most of it is sponsored by Pakistan. It's the Pakistan state policy. It is not non-state actors as some of us believe. But when it comes to acting against Pakistan, so many countries just back out because their national interests don't align with that. And they said, okay, it's your problem, then you deal with it. So, that terrorist, which is our terrorist, becomes a freedom fighter for Pakistan, for the other nations. So I think that sort of a thing has to, we have to come to a common understanding of the word terrorism. We have to have a platform, we have to have a body which is, looking at all these things. We have to have intelligence agencies which work together. We have to have, especially look at the what we call the Hawala rackets and where the money and the funding comes for terrorism. So if you really want to fight the global war on terrorism, it has to be a global war. Let's take the example of the USA. They talk of the global war on terrorism, but supply weapons and equipment which are not used in terrorism to Pakistan. So where is the global war on terrorism? It is more, in words and less in deeds. So we got to translate this thought into practical ideas, get structures right globally. And if you really, you want to get rid of terrorism, it's not going to happen so soon. Okay. But you have to have mechanisms which fight terrorism effectively.
Okay. What kind of mechanisms can we have going forward, Ambassador? And do you believe that the world is serious about dealing with terror?
Well, I think the world has come to realize that terrorism is the greatest single challenge facing every country in the world. General Bhatia rightly pointed out that Pakistan has been using it as an instrument of state policy, and many countries have ignored this challenge because their own interests somehow lie in ignoring rather than fighting terrorism emanating from Pakistan. Of course, we have been hit by Pakistan originating terrorism in a very, very serious manner. And I think as far as the means available to us for combating it through diplomatic means are concerned, we have been very actively engaged with other countries in setting up joint working groups for counter-terrorism. General Bhatia rightly said that many countries ignored it. Foremost, I think, in ignoring this danger from Pakistan was the United States of America. But I think countries have come to realize the seriousness of this problem, and in his New Year's Day message, literally to Pakistan, President Trump said that while on the one hand the US had given billions of dollars to Pakistan in assistance, in return it had got only lies and deceit. So countries around the world are waking up to the reality that Pakistan is a state sponsor of terrorism. Just a few days ago, the former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif regretted the fact that Pakistan had been using non-state actors for waging terrorist war against India. Terrorism is a part of state policy in Pakistan. The fact of the matter is that Pakistan cannot take on India headlong because militarily we are much stronger. So it has been pursuing a policy of waging covert warfare through terrorists, very often non-state actors, but certainly trained by the Pakistan army, sending them across, sometimes under the cover of cross-border firing, and trying to wage an indirect or a proxy war and trying to wreak havoc. So we have been engaged in fighting it, both directly and through diplomatic means, by setting up joint working groups on counterterrorism and sensitizing a number of other countries. Now, through these joint working groups, we are able to have a lot of exchange of information. Intelligence sharing is very important. Best practices we are able to exchange, upgrading of training systems, and various other forms of assistance. Because terrorism anywhere is a threat to prosperity and peace everywhere.
Sure.
I think that is the realization, and the world is beginning to share our point of view. And I think the seriousness with which Pakistan is now being tackled is evident from the fact that Pakistan has been put on the grey list, and that the FATF is engaged in trying to see how the financing of terrorism from Pakistan can be curbed and how terrorist activities emanating from that country can be brought to an end. Of course,
Sure.
it's a very uphill task.
It is,
but a
indeed.
beginning has been made.
Yeah, because Pakistan somehow seems to wriggle out of these, these holes that it finds itself in all the time. But it remains to be seen what happens this time around as well. We'll take the discussion forward now with Mr. Ranade. Mr. Ranade, I'm going to hold on to a phrase that what the ambassador said. He spoke about intelligence sharing. How important is intelligence sharing as far as the global community is concerned to tackle with the problem of terror? And does this intelligence sharing actually happen?
Well, you've got a two-part question, so let me say that intelligence sharing is vital because each country has an area which it specializes in, where they have got assets and they have access, which leads to, in fact, the root of terror. So I think intelligence sharing is very, very important, and there have been very good examples where intelligence has been shared successfully and efforts have been frustrated. But it's far from where it should be. There is no global body that or a global effort at pooling intelligence or even sharing intelligence as soon as something is detected. So I think there is a long way to go still before we really start saying that intelligence sharing is effective. There are two other factors here which I may mention.
Please do.
The first is the ideological dimension of terrorism, which we have not touched upon. And I think that is also very important, particularly for countries like us, where we have it's a cross-section of races, cultures, religions, etc., which we have in India. And here we have to be particularly sensitive to how we are tackling terrorism. And in the case of radicalization, particularly, we have started now sharing with other countries the ideological dimension. We're trying to tackle that. And I think that's something which is very important, which needs to be done and where there is some movement towards pooling. But the third thing I would say is that quite apart from intelligence sharing, which as I said is vital, we have to translate action on the ground. And I think it was General Bhatia who said that we are far, far from it, because each country has its own strategic, diplomatic and economic interests which prevent it from really identifying and putting a finger on the country which is really perpetrating terror, namely Pakistan. So here I would just suggest that while we have used diplomatic methods, we have taken it up at international fora, we have to now start thinking of something else by which the cost is imposed on people who are actually planning and perpetrating terror against us.
Sure. Let me bring in the professor now and talk about something that, that Mr. Ranade spoke about. He spoke about, radicalization. Today is the world of social media, online media, where impressionable minds are very easily lured on the World Wide Web. How do we stop that and how do we tackle that problem, really?
I think you raised a very important question here, Frank. The most famous name that comes to my mind when we talk about terrorism is Robert Thompson, who was credited at some time of clearing Malaya from insurgencies, and he says something very interesting. Terrorism has to be fought at the level of political subversion, and that's where social media plays an enormous role, both by the state and others, including terrorists. So the actual fight is sometimes mistaken, misunderstood to be as if on the ground. That's not where the fight is. Indeed, fight on the ground often has a negative influence on state agencies and forces. And that, makes people talk about state terrorism. Political subversion is the ultimate power of terrorism, and that is the ultimate aim, and that's where it has to be fought. And political engagement, therefore, is important. And as Thompson himself says, the greatest, strongest tool in fighting terrorism is intelligence. And that's where you see we don't even very often look at our capacities. In fact, we often make them scapegoats. Whenever we had an episode, we often blame intelligence being the weak. But often one reads in reports up to 30% vacancies in your intelligence agencies, 20% vacancies in your IPS officers' positions, similar number of vacancies in judiciary. Those are mechanisms that need to help the state in contesting terrorism at the political subversion level. Killing them on the ground will only give you a temporary relief, which is, of course, important. But that's not going to solve your problem. And that's where social media, again, the positive role that it has to play, it also plays negative role in that sense, is important element of state tools in using that. And I think larger picture would be to emphasize on those mechanisms and capacities that state needs to contest at the political subversion level. And that's more important. Otherwise, they keep cropping up repeatedly again and again, and we keep fighting them on the ground. And that indeed pushes the state to what we now call all-out strategies.
Sure. Talking about, how this thing is going to keep coming up again and again, the worst terror attack that we probably saw, General, was 26/11. Have we learnt anything since then? Do you believe that we are better prepared in combating terror today?
Yes, I'm optimistic, I'm positive. 26/11 was bad. So was 93 bombings, and so was 96. And, we had terror attacks all over the country. Outside J&K, I'm talking about. We have, after 26/11, we have worked. You see, what happens in a terrorist attack is, what the attack which doesn't manifest, we don't come to know. So we should not.
Unless it actually happens, you don't know the magnitude of it.
Yeah. So when it happens, we say we are a failure. When we prevent it, then we don't come to know, and rightly so. But the fact is that we still have a long way to go. Honestly, we got to get structures right, mechanisms right. The intelligence was being talked about. I think intelligence is extremely important and the first step to fighting terrorism. And in our country alone, we have 14 national intelligence agencies. Okay, the NIA is an investigating agency. So we should be working together and synergize the intelligence network to fight terrorism. Unfortunately, when the intelligence agencies work, and Mr. Narendra is here, he will bear me out, there is always a conflict between the agencies also. And that is not good for terrorism, countering terrorism. Then, ideology is a very major part of it. But we have to understand that most of the terrorism that manifests in India is engineered from across the borders from Pakistan. Pakistan is fountainhead of terrorism all over. Not only in India, I think 85 to 90% of the terror attacks world over find a direct or indirect connect with Pakistan. So, and in our case, it's a direct attack because the 10 terrorist organizations are there, they're trained out there, they're funded there, the infrastructure is there, the complete thing is engineered from there, including 26/11. And as the ambassador said, the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister said yes, that it has been done from there. So we have to actually look at terrorism from Pakistan first, because that is the most deadly terrorism that is taking place. How do we stop that? And I think that is what we need to do. We have to understand that Pakistan is waging a low-cost, high-effect war on India. So how do we stop that? We have to have a high-cost, low-effect war. And that we can only do if we raise the cost for Pakistan and we make it so costly for them that they don't wage a war for us. And surgical strike is only one part of it. But internally also you got to look at systems to make sure our intelligences work together. We are prepared to repel this terror attacks. And when these happen, if you look at even the attacks which happened in 93, 2015, the verdict was given. 2011 also, the judicial system has to come into play. That's what I'm saying, structure and mechanisms. And this is something which is going to stay with us. So I'm very sure what we need to do is we have to have a counter-terrorism policy, a counter-terrorism strategy, wean away the people, use social media as a state, have an information war policy, have structures in place to execute that policy. So there's a lot to be done.
Right. So the system needs to change with the changing times is what you're suggesting. We need to modernize our system as well. Ambassador, it's established now over the last 15 minutes that, the main sponsor of terror, at least in the Indian subcontinent, is Pakistan. How do we deal with the problem or with the rogue state called Pakistan? How do we tackle the problem? Are diplomatic means the only way forward?
Well, first of all, let me categorically state that Pakistani policy towards India is not going to change anytime in the foreseeable future. They will continue to sponsor terrorist attacks against us. I take a very good leaf out of what the General said, that we have to prevent any sort of damage to us. Prevention can take many forms. First of all, we have to have very good early warning systems where intelligence comes in. We have to have plenty of means at our disposal for hitting at the bases from where terrorist attacks are going to be launched. But then perhaps this is not going to be enough. The General very rightly reminded us of the 26 November 2008 attacks. They were waged from the sea. We have a very huge sea frontier. Again, we have a border with Nepal, which is an open border. I think that these pose major challenges to us, because even if we were to be able to control terrorism which is being directed at us from across the border in Kashmir or across the line of control in Kashmir, there is a lot that remains to be done for checking the influx of terrorists from, for instance, Nepal. If you have an open border, it can be misutilized by Pakistan, and I have reason to believe that our intelligence agencies do feel that it has been misutilized by Pakistan.
There were a few reports a few months ago about how the Chinese too were infiltrating into India or through the northeast. So that's another concern as well for us.
Indeed, but I strongly feel that we should not have an open border with any country. We have to protect our security, and therefore it is important for us to be able to stop any sort of terrorism being inflicted on us from any side. Of course, we have to also strengthen our coast guards, because we cannot afford another 26/11. Of course, needless to say, there are negative influences always at play. I think the Chinese, the games that they play, always remain a source of worry for us. Because the Pakistanis have a close equation with them. They bail out the Pakistanis whenever required. But we have to build not only pressure externally, but we have to make sure that we have all the means at our disposal to preempt, to prevent, and to hit back at any sort of attempt which is made to inflict a terrorist attack on us.
Sure. Mr. Ranade, the General raised a valid point earlier, and he said that, probably within the intelligence community itself, different arms of the intelligence agency do not communicate very effectively with each other. Is that a major problem, and how can we address that?
I think there are two levels at which intelligence agencies function. One is at the ground level, which is a very basic function, where each one is doing what he is supposed to do. But I would disagree with the General that at the higher levels, particularly as far as terrorism is concerned, I think there is a very efficient clearinghouse system in place now. When intelligence comes in, it is processed and it is shared with all the concerned people. Now, finally, the weak link is once it reaches the executive arm, which is supposed to act on it, do they really appreciate the importance of that intelligence or do they not? And I think that matter also a few years ago was taken up, and it was decided that this agency, which actually acts as a clearinghouse, which is within the intelligence apparatus, they will follow up the intelligence that is sent. So I think to some extent remedial measures have been brought in. But if I may just add one more thing, there are two dimensions when we are looking at terror. It's a multi-dimensional effort that is required. A whole lot of things go into place. You need, of course, social media. That's one part of it. Subversion comes much later. That is when action by the other side has already started. So basically, if we look at wherever the fight against terror has succeeded, we will find that preemption has been a very major part of it. So what we need to look at today is, as I said, imposing costs on the perpetrator. How do we impose that? There are various methods which I think we need to understand and go ahead with. Because until and unless that is done, the fighting them on our ground, fighting them on our soil, puts us at a disadvantage because they're already in. We then have to figure out how many have got in and what their plans are. So it is best to remove the problem from the root.
Sure. Professor, you know, over the years, we've seen different phases of terror. We've seen terror itself evolving and changing.
Sure.
Have we been able to effectively catch up with terror, and are we prepared for the next phase of terrorism?
I'm not sure if we are able to catch up with terrorists all the time. The greatest strength of terrorism is they are invisible. And they could be anywhere. And state forces are always visible and therefore target. But I think it's interesting to see that India in some ways has emerged as a kind of a laboratory for terrorism. In some ways you have ideologically driven terrorism here, you have religiously driven terrorism here, you have cross-border terrorism here, you have allegations of state terrorism here. You know, all kinds of terrorism exists here. So there's a whole range of the kind of motivations that terrorists have. The fundamental difficulty I think today in the world is that howsoever powerful a state is, it can no longer address the problem of terrorism by itself. So that's one. I think we have been pushing for a United Nations Comprehensive Convention on Countering Terrorism from 1996 onwards, and Prime Minister is pushing it in all his visits now seriously. There is an ad hoc group set up to consider the first draft on that. And also to see how at the regional level we can bring other neighbors together. We have had, in fact, we were the first in 1987 to have at the SAARC level suppression of terrorism, the convention signed much earlier than world woke up to it. But it has not been implemented. So that is the difficulty, because there is no common understanding of what terrorism is. All definitions talk about, you know, non-combatants being the targets, the violence being the tool of creating terror. In defining terror, all definitions use word terror. That means we have no clear understanding. So there are moderate Taliban, there are, you know, good terrorists and bad terrorists, freedom fighters and terrorists. That confusion is what makes us completely incapable of kind of cooperation building that is required, because no single state. So, you know, there's a point in criticizing Pakistan, but as Ambassador Dayal said, or even Lieutenant General said, if it suits them, they will continue with that policy. So there's no, you know, it doesn't solve our problem to blame Pakistan. Why it is that for about 4 decades plus, with policies of Bajpayee of, you know, behaving sort, bus diplomacy, inviting Musharraf here, and now with Prime Minister Modi having tough policy, nothing has delivered. People are dying on the ground every day, including forces. So I think there is some serious thinking, some radical thinking perhaps that is required. There is something that needs to be rectified at home in that sense, because this is continuing. We have tried all methods so far. We are trying to build international cooperation, which is where definition is the core. Once we are able to build a kind of a understanding of what terrorism is, then we can call people names, we can call them for scrutiny, saying this is what is happening and you're not doing good enough for us, and you have kind of committed or something that you're not complying now. But because definitions keep changing, countries keep explaining, camouflaging their activities.
Right.
And Pakistan has worked fine, and they've been, in fact, in one way, Pakistan has used terrorism against Chinese, Russians and Indians.
Right.
3 big states in the neighborhood. So they think it's a smart policy for them.
Okay. All right. Quick closing comments now from all my guests. I've got limited time left on the program. General, beginning with you.
Yeah, counterterrorism has to have is all encompassing, but in particular case of India, it is a state policy of Pakistan, and we have got to raise the cost of Pakistan militarily, diplomatically, economically, and even for information war. Without that, it's not going to
When
happen.
all methods have failed, is it time to think of something out of the box?
Yes, of course, out of the box, and it can be done. It's not it can't be done. It can be done. It has to be done, and that's the only way we'll have to secure ourselves.
Sure, Ambassador.
Make it very, very expensive for Pakistan to continue its policy. First of all, by isolating it to the extent possible. We have been successful. Pakistan is being grey-listed by the FATF. Also, make it very, very difficult for it to act as a member of the Committee of Nations. I think the Americans now have seen the danger of Pakistan more clearly than ever before. There is, of course, this unfortunate situation where friends of Pakistan keep bailing it out, but we must point out to them that even they can be endangered by the terrorism emanating from Pakistan. In any case, we have to inflict the costs on Pakistan.
Is there a difference, Ambassador, between good and bad terrorism?
But the Pakistanis perhaps are the only country in the world who think that there is. I think they have begun to realize that terrorism emanating from within Pakistan, even it has been nursed to hit against India, has begun to hit themselves too.
Sure. Mr. Ranade, terror financing is a major problem. How do we deal with that?
Well, we have to there look at what others are, how they can cooperate with us, because terror financing has many avenues, legal and illegal, and we have to try and staunch those. Some we have started doing, but in other cases, we need the cooperation of others. As far as Pakistan is concerned, since you did offer, you did suggest we can make closing comments. Let me say that apart from imposing costs on them, I think we must also remember that until and unless we start imposing costs on them, because we are the most direct sufferers, when we start imposing costs on them, other countries will also realize that Pakistan cannot be left alone as it is, and they have to do something about either compelling it to stop terror against us or cracking down on the terror machine inside Pakistan.
Sure.
I think unless we stand up for ourselves and make it known that we are going to impose costs, this will not happen.
Professor, do we need to figure out what the root of the problem is and address the root rather than try and look at it at a later stage?
I think let me say that acting tough and raising costs is good, is important. But 2-3 other points which are equally important are intelligence sharing, for example, with other countries, and making our own house in order in terms of intelligence being really much more capable. Of course, as General said, sometimes we don't know events that were saved. So I'm sure a lot of work is happening already. But more than that, addressing the motivations. What is that allows them to continuously recruit both inside and outside? What is the motivation that keeps it going? Hitting at that level, what are their grievances? And finally, of course, fish without water. Why it is that people are supporting them, and what is it that sustain them? So that kind of fish without water is the reality which we need to achieve somewhere. That could be also by looking at a lot of other developmental processes, political engagement, political participation, etc.
Right.
Those are going to play and focus on the root causes in the long run.
Sure.
Immediate could be force, but force could be only immediate but temporary. Long term has to be political engagement.
Okay, political engagement. All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program. As far as terrorism is concerned, it is a global menace that needs to be put an end to with immediate effect. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.